It's a dry, cracking heat. Jerusalem groans beneath a sky swollen with judgment. Soldiers patrol the temple grounds, but their eyes aren't on the crowds. They're searching for something gone. Behind them, in the Holy of Holies, there's only dust and echo, because the Ark of the Covenant isn't there. This isn't an accident. It isn't just missing. No one stole it. It was hidden, and not by enemies, but by priests. You imagine yourself there, back in 586 BCE, as Babylon's army looms on the horizon. The priests of Yahweh move silently by torchlight, robes brushing stone, carrying, what? Exactly a gold-covered box of acacia wood, lined with commandments, thick with divine power. Or was it something else, something far older than Moses, repurposed by generations who knew it had to be kept from the wrong hands? The Ark disappears from the biblical record here, just vanishes. No final fate, no memorial. One moment, it's the most sacred object in Israel's religion. The next, it's a whisper in exile. And here's the curious part. No one in Scripture even reacts. If you've grown up on the Indiana Jones fantasy, booby-trapped caves, Nazi meltdowns, you might expect a bit more alarm when God's footstool goes missing. But the Old Testament is silent, suspiciously silent. You can't help but wonder, did someone want us not to ask? Some claim the Ark was taken to Egypt, hidden by priests on Elephantine Island. Others say it was smuggled to Ethiopia, where a quiet Orthodox church in Axum still guards a mysterious, untouchable relic. One lone monk sits with it, until death. No one else may look. But here's what no one tells you, even in ancient Jewish tradition. Long before Indiana and Holy Grails, the Ark was already fading into myth. By the time of the Second Temple, most people hadn't seen it in generations. Rabbis disagreed about whether it had been hidden under the Temple Mount or spirited into the heavens, literally. And here's the fringe thread, the one that keeps you up a little longer. Some believe the Ark wasn't built by Israelites at all, that it predates them, that it's a leftover piece of Egypt's priestly technology, perhaps passed to Moses by someone deep within Pharaoh's inner sanctum. The Ark's construction is oddly specific gold, lining, carrying poles, electric potential. If it were just a reliquary, why the heavy insulation? There are even whispers, quiet, mostly on the edges, that it functioned like a battery, that its presence on the battlefield was more than symbolic. It's worth remembering in the book of Samuel, when unauthorized hands touch the Ark, they die instantly. What kind of wooden box kills on contact? It's easy, of course, to dismiss this as legend, except the stories never quite die. Every few decades, someone claims to have found it, in a cave near Qumran, in the tunnels beneath Jerusalem, in the Ethiopian highlands, always just beyond reach. And the moment interest flares, it's buried again. You picture a dusty Vatican file, marked Do Not Translate. A satellite photo flagged and quietly deleted. After all, what would happen if the real Ark were found, and it didn't match the biblical description? Or worse, if it did, and it worked, maybe it's better this way. You lean back, feeling the cool shadow of something massive just beyond the veil of history. And you wonder, did the Ark vanish to protect the faithful, or to keep the truth from them? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Ark still lingers in the West's imagination, but in truth, it has become a symbol of something deeper, the quiet power of what we're not told, and perhaps what we're not meant to know. You sit with the image still in your mind, a sacred object whisked away in silence, and now you drift forward through time, not centuries but millennia, to the desert caves of Qumran. It's 1947. A Bedouin boy throws a stone, a shattering jar, and from that sound, the modern world discovers something utterly ancient: scrolls. Hundreds of them, fragile, flaking, but eerily preserved. Words that hadn't seen light since the days of sandals and censers. But here's what you don't learn in school. Those scrolls weren't shared with the public for decades. No, they were locked up, sequestered by a tight circle of scholars and the church. And while the world was told they were being studied, strange things began to happen. The researchers got territorial. Some wouldn't even let others see what they'd found. Pages disappeared. Translations stalled. Whispers spread. What's in those scrolls that could shake faith itself? You trudge along a canyon trail in your imagination. Dusk closing in around the cliffs of Qumran. You feel the grit between your teeth, hear the silence of a monastic sect long vanished. The Essenes, desert mystics, obsessed with ritual purity, withdrawn from society. And yet, they were scribes, careful ones, and what they preserved wasn't just Old Testament scripture, it was other voices too. One scroll speaks of a teacher of righteousness, persecuted by the authorities, betrayed, and perhaps even martyred. The parallels to Jesus are too close for comfort, yet these writings may predate the Gospels by decades. Was this a prototype Messiah, or a forgotten chapter of early Christianity? Mainstream scholars hesitate. They say the similarities are coincidental, that there's no direct link. But then, why the hesitation in releasing these texts for so long? The Vatican claimed no involvement, but the lead researchers were Catholic, many tied to ecclesiastical institutions, and while one might say that's merely academic coincidence, you feel the shadow again. A shape in the dark, a gatekeeper's hand. The most curious scrolls weren't published until the 1990s, almost 50 years after their discovery. That's an entire generation denied access. When they did surface, they hinted at something: wild angels who fall and teach forbidden knowledge, a divine war between light and darkness, and a heavenly temple with rituals unknown to Jewish tradition. Strange forgeries, or rejected fragments of a wider, messier spiritual past. And then comes the fringe, always circling like moths near old flame. Some claim the Dead Sea Scrolls contain apocalyptic calendars counting down to secret ages. Others argue they reveal Jesus not as a unique Son of God, but part of a longer, hidden tradition of desert prophets, each claiming to renew a world ruled by Rome. One scholar even suggested that certain scrolls, heavily damaged, may have referenced the crucified. But the text breaks off, conveniently, right at the moment of clarity, as if someone trimmed the edge. Too conspiratorial, perhaps, but it doesn't explain why so many scrolls were kept behind locked doors. It wasn't just theological fear. It was control. You picture a librarian with white gloves and narrowed eyes, frowning at a parchment that contradicts 2 millennia of certainty. Easier to shelve it, or lose it, or say it's too fragmentary to matter. But you know better, because sometimes a fragment is all it takes. A single torn phrase, a strange word that shouldn't be there. That's how stories unravel. And one more thing. Among the scrolls is the copper scroll, etched not on parchment but on metal. It lists hidden treasures buried in 64 locations. Chests of silver and gold, priestly vestments, sacred vessels. Real, maybe not, but the fact that it's written so plainly, so matter-of-factly, it stirs something. No treasure has ever been found, but the scroll remains intact. And you wonder, could it be a decoy, a test, or worse, a map that was never meant to be read by us? The sands of Qumran whisper nothing. The caves have gone silent again. But you hear something beneath the silence, a feeling that somewhere, deep below the Vatican or in a back room of Oxford, there's still a box of fragments, a scroll half translated, waiting for someone curious enough to ask. You step now from the desert caves into stone corridors far colder, deeper, vaulted, lit not by flickering torch, but the quiet hum of fluorescent lights behind locked doors. Welcome to the Vatican Secret Archives, or, as they prefer to call it these days, the Vatican Apostolic Archive. A gentler name. Less cloak and dagger. But the change came oddly recently, right around the time people began asking louder questions. You walk slowly beneath the Vatican Library, down into a sub-level where the temperature never changes. Dust doesn't settle here. Air is filtered. Manuscripts sleep in climate. Controlled cases, watched over by white, gloved scholars and, occasionally, the kind of priest who doesn't wear his collar in public. Over 50 miles of shelving, more than 85 linear kilometers of secrets, and until recently, barely a fraction accessible. You can't just walk in. Even today, entry is by permission only, and granted mostly to credentialed historians. Want to see what's inside, you'd better be able to read medieval Latin, have a university letterhead, and a reason that won't raise eyebrows. Oh, and don't ask for anything too specific, especially if it's dated around 325 CE or mentions the name Jesus too often. What could possibly require that level of control? The Vatican claims it's about preservation, and, in fairness, some of the documents are fragile, papal letters from the 8th century, crumbling receipts from ancient dioceses. But rumors swirl that among these shelves sit items never meant to see daylight again. A letter from Pontius Pilate, describing a crucifixion that made the sky darken. A Gospel of Mary Magdalene, far fuller than the one in Nag Hammadi. A parchment describing how the Council of Nicaea voted not just on canon, but on whether Jesus was human at all. Too dramatic? Maybe. But consider this in 1245 during the Council of Lyon. A curious document was supposedly submitted by an Eastern monk, an alternate genealogy of Christ, traced through an entirely different line. It was quickly dismissed and never seen again. That council's record preserved, but that document gone. Some say it now rests beneath Rome, in a box labeled heretical lineage. One of the more enduring tales centers around a sealed manuscript from the time of Pope Sylvester I. It allegedly outlines a prophecy delivered to Constantine himself, one that contradicted the divinity of Christ and warned of a coming age when the Church would forget its own beginning. It was said to be so dangerous. It was sealed with wax and never opened again. Strange, isn't it, a place of divine knowledge that keeps so much locked away? Even stranger is what the Church has admitted. Until 1881, no outside scholar had ever been allowed in. For centuries, this was a vault not of transparency, but of power. Popes came and went, and what they didn't burn, they hid. Entire medieval forgeries, like the donation of Constantine, sat unquestioned for hundreds of years. That one, by the way, granted the Pope sovereignty over all of Western Europe. It was a fake, but useful. Now, here's a quirk for you, nestled deep in those shelves. Some researchers believe there's a full, uncensored copy of the Book of Enoch down there, a text once considered canon by early Christians and still revered in Ethiopian Orthodoxy. It speaks of angels who defied heaven, of forbidden knowledge taught to mankind, and of a judgment before Noah's flood. Too vivid, too strange, removed from the Bible, erased in the West, but preserved in the shadows. And now, the question you knew was coming if you could open any file, just one. What would it be? Would you look for a lost gospel, a record of Jesus' life between ages 12 and 30? A letter from Mary, mother of Christ, describing her son in human terms, what he liked to eat, how he laughed. Or would you go further? Would you search for the so-called chronovisor, a rumored device said to exist in Vatican possession, a kind of spiritual television, created in the 1950s by a monk named Pellegrino Ernetti, that could view past events like divine CCTV? Ridiculous, right? But Ernetti was real. His deathbed confession denied nothing. He even left behind a blurry photograph of the crucifixion. The Vatican denied everything, then sealed the room where he worked. The archives remain, bigger than ever, slightly more open, but the deeper you walk, the more you feel it, that hum beneath the words. Not electrical, not digital. It's the hum of withheld truth. You wonder how many books were rewritten by omission, how many truths were too destabilizing to preserve. Maybe, just maybe, there's a reason these shelves remain so very quiet. And yet, the door never quite locks behind you, not fully. You leave the archives in your mind now, walking backwards into the soft evening, into a Rome that never quite forgets. And you ask yourself, who decides what is sacred? The writer, the reader, or the one with the key? The candlelight flickers over rough parchment. You're in a cramped room, stone walls, low ceiling, a single slit of a window letting in moonlight. Around you, scrolls, so many scrolls, and one set aside. It's a gospel, but not Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. This one bears a different name, and here begins a quiet war most never hear about. Because while the official Gospels were sealed into canon by bishops and councils, others were quietly excluded. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas, fragments of ancient Christianities, real, diverse, and terrifying to the emerging orthodoxy. You flip the scroll gently in your imagination. It opens not with a nativity or a resurrection. It begins with words, puzzling, cryptic words. These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, and which Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down. Not stories, sayings. No miracles, no passion, just wisdom. Sharp and strange. Jesus here is not a sacrifice, but a revealer. A teller of riddles meant to awaken something inside you, not save you from outside doom. What do you do with a gospel like that? If you're the early church, you bury it, literally, in the dry sands of Nag Hammadi, Egypt. A clay jar lay sealed for over 1,500 years. Inside 13 leather, bound papyrus codices, lost gospels, hidden by monks likely fleeing persecution from other Christians, not Romans. Christians silencing Christians. It's hard to overstate this. The early centuries of the church weren't tidy. They were chaotic, contested, filled with competing visions of Jesus. Was he divine from birth? Adopted at baptism? A spirit who only seemed to have flesh, or something stranger still? A mirror to our own hidden self, the Gospel of Mary. Yes, that Mary offers this unsettling scene, Peter arguing with her, doubting her account of Jesus' secret teachings. Mary weeps, not because she lied, but because even the apostles don't believe her. A woman speaking truth. And for that, erased, the Gospel of Judas even more radical. In this telling, Judas isn't a traitor. He's the only disciple who understands Jesus, the one entrusted to help him shed his mortal form. Betrayal becomes obedience. Darkness becomes insight. Try canonizing that. So the Church didn't. It canonized the 4 Gospels that most closely agreed, and labeled the others Gnostic, a dirty word meaning hidden, elitist, heretical. And yet, the root of that word gnosis, knowledge, which makes you wonder, were these Gospels discarded because they were false, or because they were dangerously true in the wrong way? Here's a curious tidbit. The earliest full New Testament list we have, the Muratorian fragment from the late 2nd century, includes the Apocalypse of Peter and excludes several now, canon books. The canon wasn't dropped from heaven. It was debated, often bitterly, and not just in Rome. In Syria, the Gospel of Thomas held sway for centuries. In Egypt, Gnostic communities thrived underground. Ethiopia preserved books long lost to the West, and in every place the Church consolidated power. Texts were tested, not for truth, but for unity. You imagine the scene, a bishop, squinting at a scroll, frowning. Too vague, too mystical, too open-ended. He sets it aside, not because it's false, but because it asks the reader to think. That's dangerous. A sleeping population is easier to lead than one chasing private revelation. Even today, these Gospels remain in the margins. You won't hear them preached from the pulpit. You won't find them in your hotel nightstand. But they exist, translated now, published, quietly read by those curious enough to look. And they are beautiful. One line from Thomas lingers with you if you bring forth what is within you. What you bring forth will save you. Not hellfire, not sin, not sacrifice, just the mirror. These are not bedtime verses. But they make you wonder how many lost teachings lie waiting, buried not in the sand, but in your bookshelf, mistaken for apocrypha. How many Gospels remain unwritten, because they live in memory, not ink. The candle flickers again. You roll the scroll gently closed. Behind you, someone coughs. A door creaks open. The bishop has returned, and with him, a fire. It's a chill morning in 1307, and your breath fogs the air as you ride through the forest toward a quiet Templar outpost. The ground is still wet from last night's rain, and in the trees, the birds haven't begun to sing. Too quiet. The men in front of you, Templars, armored, alert, have that look. They know something's coming. By nightfall, most of them will be in chains. The Knights Templar, monks with swords, defenders of pilgrims, builders of fortresses, bankers to kings. For nearly 2 centuries, they held unimaginable power. But then, in a flash, they vanished, arrested en masse on a Friday the 13th. In fact, ever since, the date's been whispered as cursed. But why were they really erased? The official story is heresy, idolatry, witchcraft, confessions extracted under torture. You've probably heard of Baphomet, the strange, bearded head the Templars were said to worship. The church claimed they spat on the cross, kissed each other in shameful rites, denied Christ altogether. It sounds suspiciously theatrical. And yet, beneath the propaganda, something glimmers, because they did venerate a mysterious head, at least according to their own inventories. One such item was described in a 1308 document as a great head of gilded silver, with the face of a woman. Another, allegedly, bore inscriptions in an unknown language. Some say it was a mummified relic, others a carved idol. But there's a murmur, just beneath the surface, that this wasn't mere superstition. It was technology. Some fringe historians argue the head was mechanical, a speaking automaton, passed down from the East. The Templars spent decades in the Holy Land. Could they have inherited something older than Christianity, perhaps even from Alexandria or Babylon? You recall the legends of oracles, talking statues, prophetic heads, the kind that speak only to initiates, not metaphor, not parable, device, and there's the whisper of a deeper story still, that the Templars had uncovered something beneath the Temple Mount. Yes, that temple, the one that once housed the Ark. They had access. They dug. They stayed longer than necessary. What did they find? It's telling that the French king, Philip I, feared them enough to wipe them out in a single coordinated arrest. But what exactly scared him? Their wealth, their secrecy, or their knowledge? The Pope, Clement Vab, was weak, elected under Philip's influence. When Philip demanded action, Clement obeyed. But years later, on his deathbed, he reportedly tried to atone, calling his condemnation of the Templars a sin. The Church quietly erased the absolution. It didn't fit the narrative. Here's something odd, despite the gravity of the charges. Not a single Templar relic has ever been produced. No Baphomet, no head. Nothing concrete, just records and silence. And yet, the Templars never truly vanished. Their symbols endure, carved into obscure churches, embedded in Freemason lore, even etched into the currency of nations. Some believe the order went underground. Others say it never really died, just changed names. In Portugal, they became the Order of Christ. Same members, different robes, And who do you think backed the voyages of Columbus-funded maps that traced coastlines centuries before satellites? You pass your fingers over a Templar coin, 8, pointed star. Twin riders on one horse, cryptic, economical, always two meanings. And now the whispers get stranger. Some claim the Templars worshipped a severed head not because they were mad, but because it preserved something a brain, perhaps still charged with electrical impulse, the relic of a prophet, a source of divine insight, or, a terrifying possibility, a preserved remnant of Jesus himself. Absurd, perhaps, but in medieval relic culture, the sacred body was currency. Saints' bones, martyrs' fingers, even drops of milk said to be from Mary herself. A head would be the ultimate relic, especially if it still responded. Some say it did. Of course, mainstream historians scoff. The head was symbolic, they argue. An accusation inflated to justify destruction. But it's odd, isn't it? How quickly the Church moved. How efficiently Philip coordinated with the Inquisition, as if they feared not just the Templars, but what they carried. The order died in fire. Grand Master Jacques de Molay, burned alive, cursed both Pope and King from the pyre. Both died within a year. Coincidence? Yes. But it set the tone. The Templars became a legend, a question mark carved into stone, and the head, the one they called Baphomet, still missing. You feel the chill again, not from night, but from the sense that something once stood in that stone chamber, something that spoke without lungs, something that remembered. Perhaps it was wisdom, perhaps it was deception. But the silence it left behind still echoes. You're standing in a battlefield, but it's quiet now. The banners have been lowered. The blood is long dry. Only statues remain, white, serene, as if history had been carved into stillness. But in the center of it all, a dream. One man's dream. He wakes in the night, vision glowing behind his eyes, a flaming cross in the sky, and words in Latin, in hoc signo vinces, in this sign, you will conquer. The man is Constantine. The year is 312, and the world is about to change. Or so the story goes. You've probably heard it framed as a miraculous turning point. A pagan emperor sees a holy vision, wins a critical battle, and converts to Christianity. He ends the persecutions. He legalizes the church. Eventually, he calls the Council of Nicaea to codify doctrine. Without him, the Christian West might never have risen. But the deeper you go, the more the dream begins to blur. Because Constantine's conversion story didn't appear until years after his victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. In fact, the earliest account, written by Lactantius, not Constantine himself, describes a dream, not a vision in the sky. And it wasn't a cross, it was a heavenly sign. Later, in Eusebius's telling, it morphs. Now it's a vision during the day, seen by the whole army. A flaming cross of light appears above the sun. But Eusebius admits something curious. He only heard this version from Constantine much later, near the emperor's death, decades after the event. You sit with that for a moment. Imagine Constantine, the master politician, crafting his own legend, not a witness to a miracle, but the author of one. He wasn't baptized until his deathbed. He kept the title Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of Rome's traditional religion. He built churches, but also maintained pagan temples. In short, he was hedging his bets. Like a seasoned general, he was playing both sides. So why invent a vision? Because Constantine needed to unify a divided empire. Christianity, fractured and persecuted though it was, had one great advantage: it was everywhere. Its members were literate, networked, and organized. And most importantly, they were hungry for legitimacy. Enter the symbol the chi, rho, an intersection of Greek letters, XP, often mistaken for a cross. Constantine painted it on his soldiers' shields. But here's the thing: the chi, rho, wasn't uniquely Christian. It had been used in various mystery cults. It symbolized power, not necessarily faith. And now the conspiratorial whisper: what if Constantine's vision was not divine, but strategic? Imagine it. A crafted myth, planted early, then allowed to grow. A fiery sign in the heavens, like Moses' burning bush, but repurposed for imperial authority. After all, what better way to silence rivals than to claim God chose you directly? Mainstream historians often soften this view. They call Constantine a sincere convert, but admit his Christianity was politically convenient. That's putting it lightly. He summoned bishops like senators, presided over councils like a Caesar. At Nicaea, he didn't just host the debate, he influenced it. He urged unity, not truth. And what emerged was not revelation, but consensus. Majority vote. Divine mystery. Standardized. You picture it: robes rustling, scrolls unrolling, voices raised, not in prayer, but in strategy. Theology shaped by compromise. Heresies declared not for falsehood, but for faction. And Constantine. He smiled. The empire began to wrap itself in Christian language, but retained Roman structure. Pagan festivals were baptized with new names. Saturnalia became Christmas. Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, became a metaphor for Christ. You begin to see the shape of it now, not a sudden conversion, but a merger, a spiritual rebranding. There's even evidence, fringe, yes, but curious, that Constantine may have held on to Mithraic rites long after his supposed conversion. The sun god Mithras, worshipped in underground temples, bore uncanny similarities to Christ born on December 25th, resurrected, savior of mankind. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe Constantine simply chose a new mythology that felt familiar. He built churches, yes. He even moved the empire's capital to Byzantium, renamed it Constantinople, and crowned it with a giant statue of himself, holding a sun disk, not a cross. A disk? This wasn't humility. This was empire cloaked in piety. You run your fingers along the edge of a coin from his reign. On one side, a Christian symbol. On the other, Sol Invictus, radiant and eternal. And you begin to suspect Constantine didn't dream of God. He dreamed of control. Control of heaven. Control of earth. And perhaps most audacious of all, control of the narrative. Because what is history, after all? But a dream we agree to believe. The room is thick with incense. Candles burn low in heavy gold holders. You sit cross-legged on the cold stone floor, listening, not to music, not to preaching, but to debate. Heated, tense, echoing off marble columns. It's the year 325 CE, and you are in Nicaea. Around you, Bishops from across the empire argue with clenched fists and furrowed brows. Their robes are fine, but worn from travel. Many have walked for weeks to be here. Called by Constantine himself, they gather not to worship, but to decide, once and for all, what Christianity actually is, and more to the point, what it is not. You'd expect a moment like this to be holy, reverent, but what unfolds is anything but. Voices rise, accusations fly. At one point, a bishop named Nicholas, yes, that Nicholas, later known as Saint Nick, crosses the floor and slaps a man across the face. The man he strikes is Arius, and Arius is the problem. Arius taught that Jesus, the Son, was not equal to God the Father. That Christ had a beginning, that there was a time when the Son did not exist. It was a view that made Jesus seem more human, more tragic, but to others it was heresy. What's often forgotten is this Arius was not some fringe preacher. His ideas had spread rapidly, especially in Egypt and the eastern provinces. He had popular songs, catchy theological rhymes. His theology was dangerous precisely because it resonated. The council debates for weeks, and then something extraordinary happens. By vote, yes, vote, they decide Jesus is homoousios with the Father, of the same substance, not similar, not subordinate, equal, eternal. And with that, something disappears. All the other versions of Christ, the teacher, the enlightened human, the adopted son, the prophet, are quietly exiled, rewritten as heresies, not because they were proven wrong, but because they lost the vote. You watch as scribes begin drafting a statement, the Nicene Creed. It will define orthodoxy for centuries, but at the time, it's less a prayer than a political treaty. Now, here's a detail they don't often tell you. Many bishops didn't agree, but signed anyway, under pressure from Constantine. A few were exiled for refusal, their writings destroyed. Arius himself was branded a heretic, his books burned, but later, when Constantine's sister converted to Arian Christianity, the emperor conveniently changed sides, truth or politics. Even stranger, Constantine wasn't baptized until years later, and by an Arian bishop. You let that sink in. The emperor who enforced the Nicene Creed died outside it. Still, the creed held, and with it came a flood of censorship. Gospels that hinted at alternate Christs gone, texts that blurred the divine and human buried, preachers who remembered a more mystical Jesus silenced. And here's a fringe detail that flickers, just on the edge of the torchlight. Some scholars believe a whole series of pre-Nicene teachings, oral traditions, local liturgies, even early letters, were systematically destroyed in the years following the council, not for blasphemy, but for confusion. The new church needed clarity, unity, simplicity. And Jesus, God incarnate, crucified and risen, was easier to worship than Jesus the sage, the mystic, the enigma. A carved statue is easier to control than a whisper. You picture a young convert in 4th century Cappadocia, asking too many questions. But what about the Gospel of Thomas, she asks. Why does it say the kingdom is inside us? The priest frowns, tells her it's not real, moves the conversation back to safer ground, and thus, bit by bit, the range of Jesus' identity narrows. One version remains the imperial Christ, crowned in heaven, reflected on earth in the emperor's own regalia, it's no accident that after Nicaea, Christ begins to look more like a Roman emperor in art. Gone is the humble shepherd. Enter the enthroned judge, haloed in gold, hand raised not in blessing, but command. Nicaea didn't just define orthodoxy, it eliminated alternatives. And though the Church would call this unity, you, sitting here centuries later, might call it something else, consolidation. After all, what better way to shape the divine than to give it form, bound by creed, backed by law, and sanctioned by Caesar himself? As the council concludes, the bishops sign the final document, some with trembling hands. Outside, the world continues. Caravans roll on, farmers till soil, children learn prayers, but something has changed. A door has closed, and behind it, 1,000 forgotten Christs remain, waiting. You sit on a smooth stone bench beneath a fig tree, the sun dappled through its wide green leaves. Beside you, a woman adjusts her shawl. Her eyes are steady. She speaks with calm authority. She tells you things no man would dare to say aloud in this world, not because they aren't true, but because they are. Her name is Mary, not the Virgin, not the Mother, but the Magdalene, and she is not what they told you she was. Forget the perfume, the tears, the hair. That version, the penitent sinner, the fallen woman, didn't exist for the first 500 years of Christian history. She was added later, deliberately. But the original Mary Magdalene, she was something else entirely, a witness, a teacher, possibly the closest disciple Jesus ever had. The Gospels all agree on one thing. Mary is the first to witness the resurrection. Not Peter, not John, Mary. And in a world where women's testimony held no legal weight, that detail mattered. The early church fathers wrestled with it. Some quietly edited around it. Others absorbed it with a wince, but they couldn't erase her. Not entirely. So, instead, they rebranded her. It began subtly. Pope Gregory III, preaching in the 6th century, combined several women of the New Testament into one Mary of Magdala, the unnamed sinful woman, and Mary of Bethany. He merged them into a single figure, then declared her a prostitute. The Church would repeat that for over 1,000 years, even though the Gospels never say it. It was a character assassination cloaked in repentance, and it worked. Mary was recast as a warning of desire, of emotion, of stepping out of bounds. Her closeness to Jesus was reinterpreted as inappropriate, her knowledge suspect, her leadership erased. But fragments remain. The Gospel of Mary, discovered in the 19th century, speaks in her voice. In it, after the resurrection, she comforts the other disciples. She recalls private teachings Jesus gave only to her. When Peter objects, did he really speak privately with a woman? Mary holds firm. And that's when you realize Peter isn't angry because he doubts her. He's angry because he knows she's right. This gospel is incomplete. The manuscript breaks off mid-discussion, but what survives is powerful. Mary speaks of the soul's ascent through realms of ignorance, of freeing oneself from illusion. It's mystical, abstract. Less about sin, more about awakening. No wonder it was buried. Here's a peculiar fringe note in some Gnostic sects. Mary wasn't just the favored disciple, she was the consort, not romantically, necessarily, but spiritually. A match to Christ's own energy, the feminine to his masculine, the intuition to his intellect, not subordinate, equal. Even mainstream Gospels hint at something deeper. In John's account, when Mary sees the risen Jesus, he tells her, "Do not cling to me." Strange words for a casual acquaintance. Stranger still when paired with her title, in certain early texts, Apostle to the Apostles. That's not poetry, that's rank. The early church knew this. Some honored her accordingly, especially in the East, where icons show her holding a red egg, a symbol of resurrection. But in the West, where hierarchy stiffened, Mary's image began to bend. By the Middle Ages, she was draped in velvet, weeping eternally, eyes cast down, a cautionary tale, a whisper of what happens when women step too far into mystery. But the Magdalene has never entirely disappeared. Her name keeps surfacing on secret maps, in apocryphal stories, in coded art. The Cathars, those gentle heretics of southern France, revered her. The Templars may have guarded sites linked to her legacy. In Provençal legend, she fled to Gaul after the crucifixion, lived in a cave, and taught in secret until her death. A nice folk tale, perhaps. Or maybe her exile was real. Maybe the church didn't just forget Mary Magdalene. They banished her, because a woman with sacred knowledge is a dangerous thing. You picture her now, walking quietly at Jesus' side, speaking with him in the hours the Gospels skip, asking hard questions, hearing stranger answers, and maybe, just maybe, writing them down. You won't find those scrolls in the canon, but you might find them under glass, in a locked drawer in a museum basement, or in the footnotes of a forgotten manuscript, or in the quiet sense that something has always been missing from the story. And her name is Mary, not weeping, not repentant, but teaching. The room smells of ink and beeswax. You lean over a rough desk, candle guttering as you trace the neat, looping script of a monk lost to history, except for what he left behind. His name was Isidorus, or maybe Markov, or Hilarius of Tours. His real name doesn't matter. What matters is what he did. He was a forger, but not in the way you're thinking. Not a criminal, not a liar for coin. He was, in his own way, a theologian, a myth-maker, a weaver of reality. In the monasteries of medieval Europe, monks weren't just copying texts, they were editing them, adjusting, clarifying, occasionally inventing. And among the most notorious of these was a group of forgeries that reshaped church power for centuries. The pseudo-Isidorian decretals. That name alone sounds suspicious. Pseudo, a mask. These decretals appeared in the 9th century, claiming to be letters from early popes, stretching back to Clement and beyond. They emphasized papal authority, the sacred rights of bishops, and the supremacy of Rome over local churches, a defense against corruption. Maybe, but they were fake, entirely fabricated. And yet, no one noticed, not for hundreds of years. You imagine a monk in a cold scriptorium, carefully aging the parchment, mimicking older handwriting styles. He inserts the forged texts between genuine ones, padding his lies with truth. It's elegant, convincing, and devastatingly effective. For centuries, canon law cited these documents as authentic. They became the spine of papal power during the medieval era. Even when suspicions arose, the Church hesitated to disown them. Too much had already been built upon their foundation. And here's the twist: the forger may have believed he was saving the Church. In the 800s, the Frankish kings were powerful, meddling in episcopal elections, treating bishops like vassals. By creating false documents that bolstered papal independence, the forgers may have thought they were protecting spiritual authority from secular abuse. A noble lie, but still a lie. Centuries later, scholars like David Blondel and Jean Ardouin began pulling the threads. They noticed inconsistencies, popes quoted earlier, popes who couldn't have existed yet, anachronisms in legal terms, sudden spikes in papal power where none should be. And yet, nothing was undone. Even after the forgery was exposed, the Church continued to operate on its structure, because sometimes falsehood becomes foundation. The house is too big now. You can't pull the stone without collapsing the walls, but the rabbit hole goes deeper. The most famous of these forgeries may not be a decretal at all, but something called the Donation of Constantine. You've heard of it, perhaps as a political footnote, but at the time it was sacred history. The donation claimed that Emperor Constantine had, upon converting to Christianity, given Pope Sylvester I dominion over Rome, Italy, and the Western Empire. Land, authority, power, all gifted, supposedly, because the Pope had healed him of leprosy. It was written in the 8th century, and it was used extensively to justify papal temporal rule. When German emperors challenged the Pope's authority, this document was thrust forward as evidence. You hold your crown, the Pope might say, because we allow it. But it was a fake. Lorenzo Valla, a Renaissance scholar, proved it in the 15th century by analyzing the Latin. Too modern, too clumsy, full of terms that didn't exist in Constantine's day. A forgery, a bad one, in retrospect. And yet, for centuries, it worked. You lean back and feel the chill of that idea: the Church's authority in the West, its right to rule as both spiritual and temporal power, was built, in part, on a fabricated document, copied by candlelight by a monk with steady hands and heavy purpose. Why did they do it? Because narrative wins. Truth is a candle, but story is the fire. And in the medieval mind, history wasn't about facts, it was about meaning. If a lie served the divine, perhaps it wasn't truly a lie. Perhaps it was inspired. You feel the weight of this as you consider how many texts were altered in the name of order, how many saints invented, how many miracles reworded. It's not just pseudo-Isidore. It's a whole genre, the sacred forgery, a tool of control, yes, but also of belief. The Church did not need to lie maliciously. It simply needed to guide, and sometimes, to guide, you have to put words in a dead man's mouth. So you close the forged codex gently. And for a moment, you wonder, what if the truth has never been about what happened, but what we've been told had to happen? It's early morning in the Highlands of Ireland. Mist creeps across the hills like a living thing. curling around standing stones and the black, roofed silhouette of an ancient monastery. Bells ring, not from metal, but from carved wooden clappers, struck gently in rhythm with a world far older than Rome. This is Celtic Christianity, and it is about to vanish, not in fire, not in some grand inquisition, but quietly, elegantly. Erased not by destruction, but by replacement, you walk the narrow path between the mossy stone cells of Iona Abbey. It's the 7th century, and the monks here chant psalms not in Latin, but in an old, lilting tongue. They shave their heads not in the Roman corona tonsure, but with the front of the scalp bare, like Druids. Their Easter doesn't match Rome's calendar. Their theology is rich in nature, in visions, in mystery. They follow Christ, but in a way that feels older, wilder. These monks know the scriptures by heart. They transcribe them in spiraling calligraphy, full of golden beasts and Celtic knots. Their churches are simple, no marble, no gilded altar, just stone, song, and stars overhead, and the Roman Church hated it, not openly, not all at once. But you can feel it in the documents that survive a quiet, methodical pressure to bring these Christians into line. Synods are held, councils convened, and always the same goal: conformity. One of the most pivotal moments comes at the Synod of Whitby in 664, a gathering meant to decide whose calendar, customs, and haircuts would define Christianity in Britain. On one side, the Roman party, with their bishops, their precision, their ties to the Vatican. On the other, the Celtic monks, led by Abbot Colman, humble, mystical, and unyielding. The vote goes to Rome, and with that, the slow absorption begins. But here's the subtle horror: the Celtic Church wasn't heretical. It wasn't rebellious. It was simply different. Emphasizing personal spiritual experience over centralized authority, valuing dreams, visions, and nature's rhythms over hierarchy and liturgical control. It preserved old prayers that named the stars. It allowed women greater spiritual presence. It spoke of the Trinity in language soft and strange, as a dance, not a doctrine. And it was scrubbed away, not with violence, with letters. Rome sent emissaries, imposed liturgical texts, revised monastic rules. Over time, the Celtic bishops were replaced, their practices absorbed, diluted, and rewritten. Most of what we know about them comes from their enemies or from the margins of manuscripts that barely survived. And yet, the traces remain. There's a prayer attributed to St. Patrick, called the Deer's Cry. I arise today through the strength of heaven, light of sun, radiance of moon, splendor of fire. Not a standard Roman invocation. It reads more like a Druidic chant adapted for Christ, a fusion of worlds. A Christianity that saw no need to destroy what came before, but to bless it anew. Here's the twist you've been waiting for. Some fringe historians believe the Celtic Church preserved teachings from early, possibly pre-Roman Christianity brought by travelers long before Augustine ever set foot on English soil. Maybe even by disciples from the eastern Mediterranean. Joseph of Arimathea, they say, came to Glastonbury. Apostles wandering west, quietly planting seeds of a faith that grew without papal permission. A version of Christianity without Rome, and Rome couldn't allow that. It's telling that so many Celtic saints, Columba, Brigid, Cuthbert, remain only loosely defined. Their legends blend miracles with folklore, Christ with the other world. Brigid, especially, may have originally been a goddess, recast as a nun, then canonized. Her flame at Kildare burned perpetually. Female monks tended it, until Rome declared it pagan and shut it down, but it kept being relit. Again and again, even now, echoes of the old Celtic ways persist in prayers whispered at farm gates, in crosses carved with spirals, in blessings given to rivers and trees, a spiritual memory that refuses to die. You feel it in the land itself. The hills don't forget, and neither do you. Because buried under centuries of marble and gold, beneath the domes and decrees, lies a gentler, older faith, one that walked barefoot, that sang with birds, that saw the face of Christ not only in the chalice, but in the dew, and maybe, just maybe, it waits to return. You walk along the harbor, the salty wind of Alexandria curling through your cloak. It's the 3rd century, and the city is alive, markets shouting, ships docking, languages intertwining, Greek, Coptic, Latin, Hebrew. But it's not the noise that draws you, it's the silence, specifically the silence left behind by fire. The great library of Alexandria. Everyone knows the name, but few know the truth, because despite what you may have heard, the library didn't burn once. It burned many times, each fire a little quieter, each loss a little more complete. You turn the corner and look toward the Serapeum, once a temple, later part of the library's vast complex. Beneath it, vaults, chambers, hidden alcoves. Some say scrolls were stored there. Others whisper they still are. The final burn came around 391 CE, during the purge of pagan temples ordered by the Christian Emperor Theodosius. The Serapeum was targeted, statues smashed, priests exiled. And if scrolls remained, they fed the flames. But was it truly a war against paganism, or something more subtle? Here's the riddle: no one ever produced an inventory of what the library contained. No catalog survives. We don't know how much was lost, only that it was immense. Some estimates say 400,000 scrolls. Others claim closer to 1 million. And buried within that, possibly texts we were never meant to read. Accounts tell of works by Orpheus, the Egyptian Book of Thoth, commentaries from Babylonian priests, Atlantean lore, strange star maps, fringe sure. But there's a pattern to the loss. Anything that connected ancient religions outside the Roman, Christian arc was vulnerable. And this is where it gets uncomfortable. Because while popular history blames Julius Caesar, or Theophilus, or even Muslim invaders centuries later, there's a theory more disturbing still, that Rome itself, Christian Rome, wanted Alexandria to fall. The early church needed authority. Unquestionable, canonical, but Alexandria, it was a crucible of difference. Jewish mysticism, Greek philosophy, Egyptian ritual, Christian Gnostics mingled freely with Neoplatonists. It was here that early theologians like Clement and Origen dared to ask big questions. What if creation was layered? What if salvation was knowledge? What if Jesus was not unique, but a pattern? Ideas like that were dangerous. So, perhaps, what burned was not just parchment, but plurality. There's a strange detail in an old ecclesiastical letter from the 4th century. It mentions the books of the old wisdom, kept too long by the heretics of Egypt. No names, no numbers, just a flicker of panic beneath the ink, as if someone feared what those books could undo. And here's where the Vatican enters the picture. Some fringe researchers suggest that during the Crusades, and especially after the fall of Constantinople, certain scrolls from the Eastern world made their way into Western hands. Whispers of texts that once lived in Alexandria, saved by desert scholars, sold in secret, and bought by Rome. There's a persistent rumor, unconfirmed, naturally, that parts of the Hermetica, those mystical writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, are kept in the Vatican's secret archives, unpublished, classified as damaging to faith. Why? Because the Hermetica proposes a vision of God that predates the Bible, not a bearded king, not even a father, but mind, the One, a force that moves through everything and within us. That idea, echoed in Gnostic texts, aligns suspiciously well with what might have once lined Alexandria's shelves. And so you picture it now, not one fire, but many, not one loss, but 1,000 small silences. A librarian, hands trembling, hiding a scroll beneath her robe, a monk, decades later, copying it into Greek, a bishop, centuries on, declaring it unsafe. And through it all, the question lingers, did the Church know what was lost, or worse, did it choose what to forget? You step back from the burned threshold of history. The wind off the harbor still carries the scent of salt and ash, and in that scent you catch something else, a whisper, a word that was once written, now gone. You descend a narrow staircase beneath the vast dome of St. Peter's Basilica. The tourists above mill about, snapping photos and admiring Michelangelo's soaring ceiling. But down here, it's quiet. The air is thick, cool, older than the marble walls. You're walking into the bones of history, literally. This is the Vatican necropolis, a city of the dead. And buried deep in its shadowed corridors lies a shrine the Church says holds the remains of St. Peter, the fisherman, the rock, the first bishop of Rome. But you pause, because what's buried here may not be Peter at all. Let's begin with what we do know. Beneath the high altar of St. Peter's, below layers of chapels and crypts, there is indeed a burial site, an ancient tomb surrounded by other first-century graves. In the 1940s, during secret wartime excavations ordered by Pope Pius X, archaeologists uncovered a wall inscribed with Greek graffiti. Peter is here, compelling, but not definitive. No bones were found in that niche, not at first. Instead, a bundle of remains wrapped in purple and gold cloth was discovered nearby in a marble-lined cavity. Human bones, male, aged around 60-70, partial and moved. And here's where things get peculiar. The Vatican claimed decades later that these bones were Peter's, that they'd been secretly preserved, examined, authenticated. But no DNA testing, no peer-reviewed reports, just quiet declarations, and an announcement from the Pope. Case closed, or not. You stand in the dark, letting your eyes adjust. The question nags at you. If Peter truly died in Rome, crucified upside down under Nero, why is the historical trail so faint? The earliest references to his tomb are vague. The earliest church fathers barely mention a grave at all, and some, like the 3rd century theologian Origen, suggest Peter was buried elsewhere, possibly in the east. There are even whispers that Peter never reached Rome at all, that his supposed Roman martyrdom was a narrative crafted centuries later to legitimize Roman supremacy over rival Christian centers like Antioch or Jerusalem. After all, if Peter, the chief apostle, was buried in your city, your church must be the most holy, right? That's the logic, and perhaps the temptation. Because while Rome rose in spiritual power, its rivals faded. Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, all diminished in time. But Rome claimed Peter, and Peter gave them authority. Here's a detail. Most miss the earliest church structures in Rome weren't dedicated to Peter. They bore names of lesser saints, local martyrs. Peter's centrality doesn't rise until the 4th century, right around the time Constantine legalizes Christianity and funds the construction of a grand basilica. Suddenly, Peter's memory explodes. A massive church is built on the Vatican Hill, over what had been a pagan necropolis. Peter's tomb, it's claimed, was already there. But some suggest that Constantine chose the site because of its prominence, not because of any apostolic remains. A case of build it, then declare it sacred, and then the fringe tidbit you didn't expect. A few outlier theories propose that the bones found beneath St. Peter's are actually female, that the purple and gold cloths, the inscriptions, the graffiti, all hint at someone else, a woman of great importance. You feel the shiver of it. Could this burial belong not to Peter, but to someone Peter silenced? Some have suggested Mary Magdalene. Others, a forgotten Gnostic prophetess. Still others argue that it's a symbolic burial, a tomb created to draw reverence, regardless of who lay inside, because relics were political. If you could anchor your cathedral to a saint's remains, you anchored your authority too. Pilgrims came. Power followed. So, what if the bones beneath the basilica are simply convenient? What if Peter's true body lies elsewhere, in some unmarked grave near Galilee? Or perhaps, if we dare imagine it, never died at all. A wild thought. But wild thoughts are how cover-ups begin to unravel. You stand now in the dim light of the necropolis. A marble box rests beneath plexiglass. A Vatican guard glances over, indifferent. You look down and feel the tug, not of faith, but of mystery. Are these the bones of the rock, or the bones of a myth, placed carefully, sealed in gold, and lowered beneath centuries of stone? You walk back up the steps. The dome reappears above you, but something's shifted. The foundation beneath your feet suddenly feels less certain. You step into the streets of Jerusalem. The year is 327 CE. The sun is white, hot above the stone, and the city brims with tension. Soldiers, priests, pilgrims, and one woman, regal and robed in imperial silk, walking slowly toward a hill outside the city walls. She is Helena, mother of Constantine, and she is on a mission, not just of faith, of discovery. Because Helena has come to find the true cross, the very wood on which Jesus was crucified. Or, so she says, the story is legendary. Helena journeys to the Holy Land in her twilight years. Guided by dreams and divine inspiration, she orders temples torn down, pagan statues removed, On Golgotha, beneath layers of Roman rubble, she unearths not one but 3 crosses. Alongside them, a plaque bearing the Latin Isus Nazarenus Rex Judeorum. But which cross is the cross? That's where the miracle comes in. A dying woman is brought forward. She touches one cross, nothing. The second, still nothing. But the third, she rises, healed. That, Helena declares, is the true cross. You let the story settle in your mind. Powerful, beautiful, and strangely convenient. Because what if it didn't happen that way? What if the discovery was less revelation and more performance? Here's what's suspicious. In the early years of Christianity, no one knew, or at least, no one mentioned the fate of the cross. The Gospels don't say it was preserved. The earliest Christians focused on resurrection, not relics. The veneration of physical objects came later, when the church grew, when pilgrims came, when symbols became currency. And Helena, she wasn't just any believer. She was the emperor's mother. Her journey wasn't just spiritual, it was imperial branding. Finding the cross gave Constantine's reign divine legitimacy. It turned Jesus' execution from shame into state, approved victory. Let's talk logistics. 3 wooden crosses buried under a Roman temple for nearly 300 years. Still intact, still recognizable, with a readable sign, highly unlikely. Wood rots. Insects devour. Time erases, unless, of course, it was never buried. Some fringe historians believe the true cross was crafted in the 4th century to support Helena's claims, not necessarily as a fraud, but as a sacred symbol, retroactively discovered to anchor the church in something tangible. A relic needed to exist. So it did, and then it multiplied. By the Middle Ages, so many fragments of the true cross were circulating through Europe that skeptics joked they could build Noah's Ark with the leftovers. Churches boasted of splinters, beams, even nails. Kings wore fragments into battle. Crusaders died to retrieve them. But where did all these pieces come from? And who certified them? Relic merchants flourished. Forgeries were rampant. And yet, the faithful never questioned. Because in a world of fire and sword, objects mattered. They made belief physical, touchable. But that's also what made them vulnerable. If you control the relic, you control the devotion. And Helena's discovery set the model. Here's a curious footnote. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built by Constantine over the site of the crucifixion, does not contain the original hill of Golgotha. Not anymore. The actual rock was carved out in antiquity, stone by stone, repurposed, so the place Christians revere isn't there anymore. It's a reconstruction, a symbol, a reminder that even the holiest things can be staged. And yet, here's where it gets slippery. What if the performance is the point Helena may have believed, truly? That she was restoring something sacred, that her discovery would unite a fractured church. Her actions inspired generations. They anchored the faith in a narrative that felt complete. So was it a cover, up or a correction? You step away from the excavation in your mind, dusting off your hands. Somewhere, a reliquary glimmers, silver, bejeweled, holding a single shard of darkened wood. Is it the cross? Does it matter? Maybe faith has always needed something to hold. And maybe Helena understood that better than anyone. But deep down, You can't shake the thought, if the cross can be staged, what else was scripted? The wind changes. You're not in Jerusalem anymore. You're in the foothills of the Himalayas. The air is thinner here, sharper, quieter. A rust-colored monastery clings to the cliffs. Prayer flags flutter like birds. Below, the valley stretches out in impossible green, and you hear something, not chanting, not bells, but a question. What if Jesus, before he became Jesus, came here? It's not just modern fiction, not just whispered in pseudo-spiritual travel memoirs. For over a century, stories have circulated about a young man, foreign, bearded, wise, traveling through India, Nepal, and Tibet, long before he appeared at the Jordan River. His name, Isa. And this is not a bedtime story. It's a challenge, because the Bible skips 18 years of Jesus' life. From age 12, where he debates the teachers in the temple, to about 30 when he's suddenly baptized and begins his ministry. The Gospels go completely silent. No carpentry stories. No teenage rebellion. No awkward moments of young divinity. Just nothing. And in that silence, a space opens wide enough to hold a journey. In 1894, a Russian traveler named Nicholas Notovich published a book describing his time in Ladakh, in what is now northern India. While recuperating from an injury at the Hemis Monastery, he claimed the monks showed him ancient scrolls, written in Pali, describing the life of Saint Isa, a foreign holy man from the West who preached love, healed the sick, and angered the priests of his homeland. The parallels to Jesus are unmistakable. Notovich was ridiculed. Scholars called it a hoax. But here's where it gets odd. Others did claim to find similar manuscripts in the region. And while the original Hemis scrolls have never surfaced again, the story refused to die. Even Swami Abhedananda, a prominent Indian spiritual teacher, traveled to Hemis years later and claimed he too saw the texts. Others came. Some were told the scrolls had been moved. Others were simply turned away. You begin to feel the hum beneath the myth, not a denial, a reluctance, as if someone wants the story forgotten. Here's a detail that lingers. Tibetan oral traditions speak of a man from the West who came seeking wisdom, studied with Buddhist monks, and taught a radical message of compassion before returning home to face persecution. They do not name him Jesus, but they do call him Isa. The notion isn't as wild as it sounds. Trade routes connected the Mediterranean and South Asia. Merchants, mystics, and messengers moved between cultures all the time. By the 1st century, Buddhism had already made it to Alexandria. Could a curious Jewish boy have traveled east, seeking what the temple priests could not offer? And here's the truly unsettling part. What if some of Jesus' teachings turn the other cheek? The inner kingdom, the emphasis on detachment and compassion, were influenced not just by Jewish tradition, but by Eastern mysticism. What if his lost years weren't a gap, but a journey? Of course, the Church has always rejected this. No official doctrine allows for Jesus the student. His knowledge, they say, was innate, divine. But you remember Luke's Gospel, how Jesus grew in wisdom. Grew. That's not omniscience. That's experience. So why the fear? Because if Jesus learned, then he changed. And if he changed, then he was human, malleable, influenced by the world around him. and that shakes the foundations. The Jesus who traveled east is not the Jesus of empire. He is gentler, stranger, less controllable. His authority is inner, not conferred by miracle or mandate. You picture him, young and unknown, walking barefoot through Bodh Gaya, listening to monks, asking questions, leaving footprints no one thought to follow. There's a line in John's Gospel, and there are also many other things which Jesus did. The which, if they should be written every one, the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. What if one of those unwritten books was set in Tibet? Not a metaphor, not a vision, but a real place, with real scrolls, locked away, or burned, or sealed under a clause of inconsistency with tradition. You sit in the monastery's shadow now. The sun is going down. A monk passes you, quiet, smiling, and you wonder, did his ancestors meet someone from the West? Long ago. Did they write about him? Did someone come later, read the words, and whisper this must be hidden? Perhaps Jesus in India isn't a fable. Perhaps it's a footnote the church erased. And in that silence, those missing 18 years, you hear not emptiness, but footsteps. The desert stretches around you, dry and aching with silence. Pale cliffs rise in jagged lines, dotted with caves. You walk slowly, feeling the press of something ancient, older than cathedrals, older than creeds. The wind carries only dust and whispers. This is Qumran, not the scrolls, not the jars, but the people who wrote them, the Essenes. And they might have been the first Christians, or something even stranger. Mainstream history paints them as a Jewish sect, ascetic, celibate, obsessed with ritual cleanliness. They lived in the desert, copied scriptures, avoided cities. They're often framed as harmless outliers, monastic precursors, spiritual hermits. But as you walk the ruined paths of Qumran in your mind, a different picture emerges. One more inconvenient. Because the more we learn about the Essenes, the more they resemble the movement that became Christianity. Too closely, in fact. They practiced communal living. They shared their goods. They baptized daily. They awaited a Messiah, not one, but two, a priestly and a royal figure. They called themselves the Sons of Light and believed they were in an apocalyptic battle against darkness. Sound familiar? You come to a cave now, shadowed and cool. Inside, a fragment of parchment waits, not scripture, but a hymn, one not found in any Bible. Blessed are you, God of knowledge, who reveals secrets to the humble. It reads like a psalm, or a beatitude, but it was written decades, maybe a century, before Jesus ever preached on a hillside. Which leads to the question, did Christ draw from the Essenes, or was he one of them? The Gospels never mention them, not once. And yet, they mention the Pharisees, the Sadducees, other sects. Why not the Essenes? Some scholars suspect they were deliberately scrubbed. Others argue that John the Baptist, wild, baptizing in the Jordan, denouncing corruption, was an Essene. That Jesus may have started in that same tradition before departing from it. Here's a detail that's hard to ignore. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's mention of a teacher of righteousness, a holy man, persecuted by a wicked priest. He is described as chosen, interpreting the law correctly, rejected by the establishment. His followers believe he was mistreated, possibly killed. The scrolls never name him, but the parallels to Jesus or someone like him are haunting. You lean in now. The cave is dark, but you can still see. The walls bear scratchings, hidden symbols. It was here. Perhaps the teachings were copied in secret, warnings wrapped in linen, sealed in jars, and hidden away. Not for safety, but for timing. Maybe they believed the world wasn't ready. Or maybe they knew the world would bury them. The Essenes didn't survive. Their settlement was destroyed around 68 CE during the Jewish-Roman War. Their scrolls, sealed in caves, were forgotten for nearly 2 millennia. When rediscovered in 1947, they shook biblical scholarship. And yet, the implications were quietly muted. Because if the Essenes were proto-Christians, if they were awaiting a Messiah who sounded eerily like Jesus before the Gospels were written, then something doesn't add up. Did Jesus fulfill their prophecy? Or did someone borrow from their vision? Fringe researchers suggest the Gospels were written in response to the Essene texts. That early Christian scribes, steeped in desert mysticism, absorbed the Qumran language and repackaged it, not maliciously, but intentionally. A spiritual upgrade, a stream made into a river. And then there's the theory that won't go away that Jesus, John, and the earliest followers were Essenes, splinters of a larger, more ancient movement. One that had been hiding in the hills for centuries. One that knew things the world wasn't meant to hear. The Dead Sea Scrolls don't talk about Rome much. They talk about inner battles, mystical visions, war between realms, a final judgment. It's not theology. It's a cosmic script. You return to the cave entrance now. The light is shifting. The desert is still. Somewhere in this silence, a page turns, not in a book, but in the soul. Perhaps the Essenes were erased not because they were wrong, but because they were too close, because their story complicated the narrative, made it messier, made Jesus less unique, more connected, less miracle, more inheritance. And the church, it thrives on clean beginnings, which is why Qumran is rarely mentioned from the pulpit. Too many echoes, too many scrolls, and maybe, just maybe, too much truth. The wind howls across the plains of Babylon. You stand beneath towering ziggurats, their bricks scorched with age, symbols carved deep into the stone. A priest passes by in a white robe, eyes rimmed with kohl, murmuring to Marduk, in his hand, clay tablets. And in those tablets is Genesis. Not the Genesis you know, and not exactly, but older versions, older gods, older floods. You're not in Israel. You're in Mesopotamia. And what you're about to uncover is that the book of Genesis, one of the foundational texts of Western religion, may not have started with Moses at all. It may have started here. The mainstream tells you the Torah was revealed at Sinai, that Moses, guided by divine hand, recorded the ancient history of the world, Adam and Eve, the serpent, the garden, the flood, the tower. But scholars have long noticed something peculiar. The Genesis creation story almost beat for beat. It mirrors a much older Babylonian myth, the Enuma Elish. In that tale, the universe begins in watery chaos. The god Marduk slays the sea monster Tiamat and splits her body in two, forming the heavens and the earth. Then, he shapes humanity from the blood of a slain rebel god, creation from chaos, blood, breath, sound familiar. Even more uncanny is the flood narrative in the Epic of Gilgamesh, written at least 1,000 years before the Torah was compiled. We meet Utnapishtim, a man warned by the gods to build a great boat. He loads it with animals, survives a divine flood, sends out birds to search for land, and eventually rests on a mountain. Noah, by another name. It would be one thing if these similarities were occasional, but they're systemic. From Adam's dust, formed body to the confusion of languages at Babel, Genesis is a patchwork, stitched together not in Sinai, but in Babylon. Here's the part they don't teach in Sunday school. Many scholars believe the Hebrew Bible as we know it was compiled, and in some cases, written during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, when Jerusalem fell and the elites were taken to Babylon. Something strange happened. They adapted, not by copying, but by transforming, taking the structure of Babylonian myths and reworking them into something new, monotheistic, ethical, Hebrew. You might say Genesis is a protest text, a theological rebellion. In the Enuma Elish, humans are created to serve the gods. In Genesis, God creates humans in his image, not slaves. Reflections, a radical inversion. But the framework remains. You can almost see the scaffolding beneath the scripture. Babylonian bones under a Hebrew skin. And if that's true, what does it mean? Did Moses carry stone tablets down from the mountain, or did scribes in exile write by lamplight, translating trauma into myth? To the faithful, this is not betrayal, it's revelation. God works through culture, through story, through time. But to others, it raises disturbing possibilities. What if the beginning wasn't original? What if Adam was not the first? What if he was a rewrite? Here's the fringe detail that keeps you up at night. Some versions of the garden myth in ancient Mesopotamia describe a paradise of the gods, full of lush vegetation, rivers, and forbidden knowledge. A serpent guards the tree, and the first humans are punished for reaching above their station. But in these older myths, the serpent is not evil. He's a guardian, a protector of the threshold, a teacher. You sit with that. If the serpent wasn't Satan, what was he, and what did we lose when that story was flipped? Even the name Eden may derive from a Sumerian word for plain or steppe. Eden, a real place, a memory, a whisper of ancient land, older than Israel, older than myth. So the next time you hear, in the beginning, you might remember that there were other beginnings, that the Bible is not a monolith, but a mosaic. And perhaps the greatest cover-up was not that Genesis borrowed from Babylon, but that we were never told. You sit beneath an oil lamp in a cramped stone room, leafing through a worn, leather-bound manuscript. The pages are uneven. The ink has faded, but the words still shine. They are gentler than you expected. No condemnation, no plagues, no wrath, just parables, quiet visions, words of comfort, soft and strange, and utterly outside the canon you grew up with. You've opened one of the Apocrypha, and what you find there is not heresy, it's hope. The word Apocrypha means hidden, but it didn't always mean forbidden. In fact, many of these texts were once cherished, read aloud in churches, quoted by saints, even bound between pages of scripture. Books like the Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, Tobit, and Baruch. They speak of righteousness, of mercy, of the soul's immortality. They fill in blanks, offer nuance, whisper what the canon shouts. And then, almost overnight, they vanished. When Martin Luther translated the Bible into German in the 16th century, he moved these books to an appendix. He didn't deny their value, but he didn't trust their authority. Later, Protestant traditions pushed them further out, labeling them non-canonical. The Catholic Church kept them, sort of, but even there, they became second-class citizens of Scripture, rarely preached, rarely printed, kept in the back pew of theology, so to speak. Why? Because they're inconvenient. Take the book of Tobit, a delightful story of angels, healing, and divine matchmaking. But it also features a female spiritual warrior, Sarah, who survives 7 failed marriages due to a jealous demon. In the end, it is she who prays with deepest clarity, who is defended, not punished, by God. Or the Wisdom of Solomon, which speaks eloquently of the soul's journey beyond death, the refinement of the righteous, and the idea that God created all things not to destroy, but to be. That's not hellfire. That's grace. The Apocrypha often lean toward inclusivity, toward mystery. They propose that God's work is broader, more compassionate than the rigid systems that came later. They soften doctrine. They complicate simplicity. And for the gatekeepers of faith, that's a problem. Now, here's the part that tickles the fringe. There are apocryphal texts far more radical than Tobit or Baruch. Texts that speak of Jesus' childhood, where he performs miracles, raises birds from clay, and even strikes a boy dead in anger before reviving him again. These infancy gospels were wildly popular in the early centuries, but were later deemed too humanizing. Why? Because they make Jesus weird, unpredictable, playful, powerful, and evolving. Then there's the Apocalypse of Peter. Once widely read, it offers a vision of the afterlife far more emotional than theological. It includes not only torments, but redemption. Sinners weep, and God grants mercy. Even the damned are restored eventually. A little too generous, don't you think? And then the Shepherd of Hermas, once considered part of Scripture by early Christians in Rome. It presents visions, dreams, conversations with angels, no doctrine, no dogma, just the slow unfolding of a soul through trial. But these were not tidy. They were not easy to organize, so the Church, over time, edited them out, not because they were false, because they were difficult. One bishop called them too poetic to be preserved, a peculiar criticism for books born of divine experience. And now, the most curious part. In some ancient churches, Ethiopian, Syriac, Coptic, these books are still read, still considered scripture. The boundaries of canon were never universal. They were political, cultural, voted on, redacted, reinforced, which makes you wonder, if sacredness can be edited, was it ever truly sacred, or is the divine in the reading, not the rule? You close the manuscript slowly. The air in the room feels heavier now, like you've glimpsed something tender beneath centuries of armor, a voice long silenced, still whispering. The Apocrypha are not threats, they are invitations to feel, to imagine, to believe, without fear. You're standing in the shadow of a basilica. Bells toll faintly in the distance, but your eyes are on the man carved into the marble relief before you, his hands raised in benediction, his expression serene. Pope Damasus I, Bishop of Rome from 366 to 384 CE. But the more you look, the more the smile begins to feel rehearsed. Because Damasus wasn't just a pope, he was a tactician, and he may have faked a past to claim the future. It starts, as so many of these stories do, with power. The church in the 4th century was no longer underground. Constantine had opened the doors, but with visibility came politics. Papal elections turned violent, literally. In Damasus's case, deadly. When the bishopric of Rome was vacated in 366, two rival factions emerged. One backed Damasus, the other backed Ursinus, a deacon with wide support from the city's poor and clergy. What followed was not a prayerful vote, but street war. Supporters of both candidates clashed in churches. The faithful fought with clubs and stones. Over 100 people were killed inside the Basilica of Sisinnius when Damasus's followers stormed the building. And when the dust settled, Damasus was pope. You pause here, because already the image of the gentle shepherd is slipping. Damasus needed to secure not just his position, but his legacy. And what better way to do that than to reshape Rome's past? He began by elevating martyrs. Literally. Damasus initiated a grand program to rediscover, promote, and glorify the tombs of early Christian saints and martyrs, many of whom had been all but forgotten. He commissioned beautiful poetic inscriptions to be placed over their burial sites in the catacombs, written in refined Latin verse. Some of these inscriptions mention visions or newly revealed knowledge about the identities of the buried. Conveniently, these saints often supported the theological and political stances Damasus himself favored. He also declared Peter and Paul as having died in Rome, together, even though no earlier source says this. It made for a stronger foundation Rome as the site of both apostolic deaths, crowned in blood and glory. He didn't just claim succession from Peter. He created Peter's Rome. But the most impactful of Damasus's moves, he commissioned a young scholar named Jerome to produce a new Latin translation of the Bible, the Vulgate, and with it, a new standard of Scripture, one that reflected Roman priorities. Jerome, brilliant and irritable, was a complex man, but under Damasus's guidance, his translations subtly reinforced the papal office's primacy. He clarified language, reshaped verses, and aligned the Latin text with the theological positions gaining favor in the West. Translation is never neutral, and neither was this one. Here's a curious example in Matthew 16:18. Jesus says to Peter, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." The Greek is ambiguous, Petros and Petra, but Jerome's Latin Vulgate solidifies it. Tu es Petrus, et super hanc Petram. It aligns Peter with the very foundation of the church. Unmistakable, Roman. You might say Damasus didn't just need a church. He needed a mythology, and he wasn't above fabricating saints to support it. Several martyrs credited with noble deaths under pagan persecution, like Saint Philomena or Saint Eusebius, have scant evidence outside the poems Damasus commissioned. Their tombs, long buried and quiet, were suddenly rediscovered with just the right inscriptions. And here's the fringe speculation that some of those poems were written before the tombs were found. Reverse archaeology. A saint needed to exist, so he was made. Does that mean Damasus was faithless? Not necessarily. Perhaps he believed the ends justified the means, that a stronger Rome, anchored in sacred bloodlines and unified scripture, was worth a few revisions. But what was lost in the process? Alternative versions of early Christian communities, ones less hierarchical, more mystical, were paved over. Gospels not chosen for the canon were buried deeper. Saints with inconvenient theology were left uncommemorated, and the Church's lineage was made to look cleaner, simpler, preordained, as if Peter had handed the keys directly to Damasus. You step back from the inscription now. The marble is worn, the letters softened by centuries of fingers tracing them in reverence. The words still gleam. They're beautiful. But are they true, or are they verse, written by a pope who knew the pen could shape eternity? It's the 9th century, and you're walking through the narrow, incense-hung corridors of the Lateran Palace in Rome. Robes brush past you. Whispers echo through vaulted stone. A new pope has just been elected, young, learned, eloquent. A reformer, they say. But some won't meet the pope's gaze, because they know. And what they know could unravel everything. They know she is not a man. This is the legend of Pope Joan. And whether or not you believe it, the fact that the Church worked so hard to erase it should make you pay attention. The story goes like this. In the mid-800s, a woman disguised herself as a man, rose through the clerical ranks, and was eventually elected pope. She ruled wisely, even brilliantly, but during a public procession through Rome, she went into labor, right there, in the middle of the street. The crowd was stunned. She gave birth, and in some tellings, she died on the spot. Others say she was stoned to death by the mob, or dragged from the city and imprisoned in secret. Either way, her name was erased, her reign struck from the records, as if she had never existed. But she did. Maybe. You look at the historical record, and something peculiar emerges. Between Pope Leo IV, who died in 855, and Benedict III, who ascended shortly thereafter, there's a gap, a strange silence. The Liber Pontificalis, the official book of papal biographies, offers inconsistent data for this period. Coincidence, maybe. But in the centuries that followed, stories of a female pope spread across Europe like wildfire. By the 13th century, the tale was accepted as fact. Even the Dominican chronicler Martin of Opava included it in his papal lists, citing Pope John VIII, a woman from Mainz. Statues of Pope Joan reportedly appeared among the busts of real popes lining the Cathedral of Siena. Then, slowly, they vanished. Here's the suspicious part. The Church didn't officially denounce the Pope Joan legend until the Reformation. For centuries, they lived with it, tolerated it, until Protestants began using it as proof of papal corruption. Only then did the Vatican pivot. A clumsy counter-narrative emerged. It never happened. It was anti-Catholic propaganda, a myth. But why so late? You begin to see a pattern. When the Church couldn't control a story, It absorbed it. When it couldn't absorb it, it buried it. And Joan. She was dangerous. Because if a woman could become pope and govern competently, perhaps even wisely, then what did that say about the Church's insistence on male authority? You picture her now, walking slowly in papal robes, veiled not just by cloth, but by centuries of fear. She would have had to be brilliant, fluent in Latin and Greek, steeped in scripture and law, skilled in diplomacy. For years, no one noticed. Or they did, and they kept the secret. There's a peculiar rumor that after her exposure, the Vatican instituted a bizarre ritual. Before a new pope was crowned, he would sit on a special chair with a hole in the seat. A young cleric would reach up to confirm the presence of male anatomy, then proclaim testiculus habet. He has testicles. It sounds absurd, but the chair exists. You can see it, carved from red porphyry, stored away now, labeled a toilet, but the design and its ceremonial use were documented for centuries. Was this the Church protecting against another Joan, or simply indulging in medieval theater? You pause now, standing in the cobbled alley where the procession allegedly ended, where Joan's labor pains revealed the truth. In the 16th century, a statue was placed here. Locals called it Petres et Papissa, the Pope and the Popess. It was quietly removed. The street is still there. The statue is not, but the legend it endures. Because Pope Joan, real or not, speaks to something the Church has never fully answered: the tension between holiness and hierarchy, between spirit and gender, between what God may call and what men will allow. She stands, cloaked in myth, at the crossroads of memory and suppression, and perhaps that's exactly where she belongs, for now. You feel the sun on your back, dry and sharp, as you step through the crumbled stones of an ancient village in the heart of Arabia. There's no tourist plaque here, no polished shrine, just old stones, fading graffiti in a forgotten script, and the unmistakable sensation that something sacred was once silenced here. This is not Mecca, it's Najran, or perhaps it's Al, Ula, or Khaybar, names that shimmer briefly in early histories before vanishing, along with their people. You're in the land of Arabia before Islam, and what you're looking for are the Christians. Yes, Christians. You see, before Muhammad's revelations, the Arabian Peninsula was not a religious vacuum. It was a swirling cauldron of belief. Polytheists, Jews, Zoroastrians, and yes, scattered Christian sects, many of them radically different from the orthodoxy forming to the north in Constantinople. They didn't build basilicas. They carved crosses into cliffs. They held communion in caves. And they may have held a version of Christianity now lost entirely. You've likely heard of the Najran massacre. In 523 CE, a Jewish Himyarite king named Nu-Nuwas, ruling in what is now Yemen, led a brutal persecution of Christians in the southern Arabian city of Najran. Women, children, and clergy were reportedly burned alive in ditches, a horror remembered even in the Quran as a Shabal, Ukhdud, the people of the trench. But what's almost never mentioned who these Christians were. They weren't Roman. They weren't even necessarily Nicene. They followed a faith shaped by Eastern ideas, likely Monophysite. maybe even closer to Gnostic. Some believe they saw Jesus not as a suffering savior, but as a cosmic messenger, a revealer, a divine spark, and their theology buried with them. Here's the strange part after the massacre. Christian powers did respond. The Byzantine Empire, working with the Aksumite Christians of Ethiopia, sent a retaliatory force that deposed Du Nuwas for a brief moment. Christianity flourished again in southern Arabia, but only briefly, because less than a century later, Islam would rise, and this is where the real silence begins. The Quran speaks respectfully of Christians and Jews, calling them people of the book. It even mentions Jesus, Isa, as a prophet. But the Christian communities of Arabia, they vanish quietly. No great purges, no apocalyptic war, just gone. You ask yourself, where did they go? Some say they converted, voluntarily or otherwise. Others claim they were absorbed into the early Muslim Ummah, allowed to live under protection but gradually diminished, their scriptures lost, their churches razed or repurposed, their unique beliefs never written down, forgotten. But then come the fringe murmurs, stories of hidden crosses found etched in mountain caves in Saudi Arabia, of oral traditions among Bedouin tribes that speak of a prophet who wore white, healed, and vanished into the sky. Tales of books burned or buried. That didn't match the Gospel or the Quran. What were these sects? Were they descendants of Nestorians from Persia, Syrian mystics fleeing Byzantine persecution, or something older still, Jewish Christians, perhaps, who never accepted Paul's theology and followed a version of Jesus that looked nothing like the Christ of Rome? We don't know, because they were never canonized. And in the absence of canon comes disappearance. Here's a chilling note. There's no archaeological evidence of major Christian churches in Mecca or Medina. And yet, the architecture of early mosques, niches facing Jerusalem, use of incense, robes, prostration, bears strange resemblances to Eastern Christian rites. Coincidence or adaptation? Some even speculate that Muhammad may have encountered these desert Christians, learned from them, debated with them, inherited from them. If true, then part of Islam's DNA includes these forgotten cousins, a buried brotherhood. But to say so aloud invites discomfort, because it blurs lines. And history, especially sacred history, doesn't like blurred lines. You trace your finger along a weathered stone in the cliffside, faintly, unmistakably, a cross, not Latin, not Greek, something else, an echo. It survived the fire, the silence, the forgetting, and now it speaks, not in words, but in presence. The Christians of Arabia may be gone, but their ghosts are patient, and they remember. You descend into the underbelly of Rome, not the tourist catacombs, but something older, stranger. The floor grows damp. The air is tight. Torches flicker off walls carved in ancient patterns, circles, stars, lions, torches, but no crosses, not yet. You've found a Mithraeum, a temple to Mithras, the god of light, loyalty, and sacred initiation. And here's the strange thing. This temple is directly beneath a church, one built centuries later, almost as if it were hiding it, or absorbing it. Mithraism is one of those shadows cast just to the side of history. It doesn't get mentioned in school books much. But in the first 3 centuries CE, right as Christianity was beginning, Mithraism was everywhere, from Britain to Syria. Soldiers and traders gathered in secret underground temples to worship a mysterious god born from stone, a god of light, of resurrection, of Sunday. Sound familiar? You crouch beneath the vaulted ceiling of the Mithraeum. The central image is always the same, Mithras slaying a bull, blood flowing. A serpent and a dog lap it up. Above, a scorpion stings the bull's testicles. Around it, stars spiral in coated constellations. This is no crude cult. It's cosmic theater. Initiates progressed through stages. Each level had a name: raven, bridegroom, soldier, lion. There were secret handshakes, ritual meals, baptisms, a shared cup, a communal meal of bread and wine. You blink, bread and wine. Yes, by the 3rd century, Mithraic rites mirrored early Christian practices so closely that church fathers began to accuse them of imitation. But Mithraism predated Christianity in the Roman world by at least a century, maybe more. Now, here's the part that feels too perfect. Many Mithraea were sealed up as Christianity spread, and yet, instead of destroying them, churches were often built directly on top, literally. The Basilica of San Clemente in Rome, built atop a 4th century church, which itself is built above a Mithraeum, layered, like sediment or strategy. One fringe theory, whispered even by a few bold archaeologists, is that Christianity didn't just replace Mithraism, it inherited it. The day Christians chose to worship, Sunday, was sacred to Mithras, the unconquered sun. December 25th, Mithras' birthday, long before it was Jesus's, the halo in Christian art, a carryover from solar imagery. The title, Light of the World. Both shared it. And then there's the name Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, a title used for both Mithras and Christ in early inscriptions. Interchangeable, ambiguous. You walk slowly through the temple. It's narrow, intimate, designed to hold maybe a dozen men. These weren't mass gatherings. They were initiations, personal, devotional, and secretive, the kind of religion Rome admired until it didn't. Mithraism's decline was rapid. By the late 4th century, it was all but erased, not just abandoned, erased, its temples buried, its symbols defaced, its memory blamed as pagan, satanic, misguided. But you can feel the echo. You see, unlike the open-air forums of Jupiter or the grand temples of Apollo, Mithraism didn't fight Christianity. It bled into it. There's a theory, hard to prove, impossible to shake, that early Roman Christians, in an attempt to win converts, adopted Mithraic structures, the liturgy, the calendar, the architecture, not in deceit, but in evolution. The new faith wrapped itself in the skin of the old, and when the wrapping was no longer needed, the body beneath was buried. And here's a curious fragment in one late Roman text. A Christian writer warns his audience against those who still call on the sun during communion. Not metaphorically, literally. The line between Christ and Mithras was thinner than we like to admit. You touch the stone altar. It's cold, worn, forgotten, but not destroyed, because maybe destruction is too loud. maybe the best way to erase a rival is to become it. Mithras slips into Christ, the sun into the sun, and Rome remains. The sun is high over Nazareth. A quiet village clings to the hillside. Stone houses, dusty roads, a carpenter's bench. Children play with hoops and pebbles. A woman carries water from the well. Everything is ordinary, except for the absence. Because here, in this quiet town, we lose him, Jesus. From age 12 to 30, the Gospels say nothing. 18 years of silence. 18 years of missing time. And in that silence, the church has been remarkably quiet. You remember the last time we saw him as a child. He was debating elders in the temple, astonishing them with his understanding. Then, without explanation, the narrative folds. When he returns, he is fully formed, teaching, healing, ready for crucifixion. What happened in between mainstream doctrine says he lived quietly in Nazareth, working as a carpenter, that he learned the Torah, perhaps studied at the synagogue, lived a humble life until his appointed hour. But the Gospels don't say that. They say nothing, which, to some, sounds less like humility and more like omission. This vacuum, the longest in Jesus' biography, has invited centuries of speculation. We've already walked through India, but there are other stories. Stories buried in Eastern Christian tradition, hidden in footnotes, dismissed as folklore. One suggests he traveled with caravans eastward to Persia, learning Zoroastrian wisdom, absorbing the fire, temples, rituals. Another speaks of a voyage to Egypt, not just as a child fleeing Herod, but later, studying under temple priests, learning mysteries from the House of Life. In Coptic fragments, there are whispers that Jesus was initiated in the Egyptian rites, symbols of death and rebirth that predate the cross. In those stories, he descends into hidden chambers beneath the pyramids. He learns silence. He returns changed, too fringe perhaps, but not entirely implausible. Trade routes were open. Nazareth was no backwater. It sat near Sepphoris, a bustling Greco-Roman city. Jesus may have spoken multiple languages: Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek. He may have met travelers, listened to stories, learned. And here's the uncomfortable question: if Jesus learned, then his knowledge was not static, which means it grew, and that threatens the image of Christ as all, knowing from birth. But there's more. Some apocryphal texts, long excluded, give tantalizing glimpses. The infancy Gospel of Thomas shows a boy Jesus experimenting with power. He molds birds from clay, then breathes life into them. He curses another child to death in anger, only to resurrect him later. It's jarring, messy, too human. But if taken symbolically, it tells a story of growth, of control earned, not inherited. You pause here, because this version of Jesus is not the one offered from the pulpit. This is not the solemn man of sorrows. This is the seeker, the wanderer, the one who becomes. And that idea, it's dangerous, because if Jesus changed, then so can we. If he found truth, rather than descending with it complete, then the spiritual journey is open, unbounded, democratic. And that's hard to regulate, which might explain why the Gospels remain silent. A clean gap, a neat transition. The child becomes a teacher, and we're told not to look behind the curtain. But the question remains, why is the silence so complete? Was it ignorance or design? One fringe theory suggests that early church fathers debated including a Gospel of Youth, a now lost text that described Jesus' formative years. It reportedly existed in some Syriac communities, but was labeled disruptive, not heretical, just inconvenient. And then there's this: some early Christians believed Jesus was trained by the Essenes at Qumran. Their strict rules, their daily baptisms, their focus on apocalyptic judgment. It all echoes in John the Baptist's ministry. And John and Jesus were family. Coincidence or clue? You return to Nazareth in your mind. A teenage boy walks alone across the hills. He's thoughtful, observant, maybe even restless. He's heard things. He's seen the Roman boots march past. He knows the scriptures, but he's asking deeper questions now. Questions not everyone is ready to hear. And so he leaves, to learn, to fail, to change. And when he returns, he is no longer Jesus of Nazareth. He is Rabbi, Messiah, Christ. And in that moment, the past falls silent. You feel the steady tick of time beneath your feet, not mechanical, but ritual. A rhythm written not in clocks, but in stars and moons. You're standing in the 4th century now, in a Rome trying to tame the calendar. But tonight, the moon is full, and Easter doesn't line up. Again. And so, the church makes a choice, a quiet revolution. They change time itself. You've likely never thought about how sacred time is structured. Days, weeks, years, divided not just by astronomy, but by meaning. The calendar isn't neutral. It's political and spiritual. In early Christianity, believers still followed the Hebrew calendar. Passover marked the season of crucifixion and resurrection. Early Christians celebrated Easter aligned with it. The first followers of Jesus, especially those in the East, continued this tradition for generations. They were called Quartodecimans, the 14thers, because they celebrated Easter on the 14th day of Nisan, regardless of the weekday. Even if it fell on a Wednesday. But in Rome, that was messy. The Western bishops wanted order, a unified celebration, a clean Sunday observance, something everyone could rally behind, something distinctly Christian. So they changed it. At the Council of Nicaea in 325, yes, that council again, bishops voted not just on doctrine, but on when Easter would fall. No longer tied to the Jewish calendar, it would now be determined by the vernal equinox and the full moon, but adjusted to ensure it always landed on a Sunday. A new formula was born. It sounds simple. It wasn't. Because this wasn't just a matter of dates, it was a severing from Judaism, from the roots of the tradition, from the original rhythm that Jesus himself would have followed. And here's the strange part. The decision wasn't made to clarify doctrine. It was made to avoid association. Church fathers openly stated they didn't want Christians following the customs of those who killed the Lord. A theological divide, cemented into time. They rewrote the calendar not for precision, but for identity. And what followed was centuries of disagreement. East and West couldn't agree on the formula. Rome used one method, Alexandria another. Even today, Catholic and Orthodox Easters don't always align. Different moons, different algorithms. That's not spirituality. That's mathematics with holy consequences. But it gets even stranger. The shift in sacred time didn't stop with Easter. The early church also debated when the new year began. January 1st wasn't always sacred. Some Christian communities marked it in March, near the equinox, tied to the resurrection. Others chose December 25th. Still others favored the Annunciation in late March. Eventually, the Roman calendar won out. January 1st, tied to the feast of the circumcision of Christ, an odd celebration, really, for the first day of the year. But perhaps that was the point. Tie time to the body. Tie it to Jesus. Tie it to Rome's Jesus. And here's a fringe whisper from the archives. There may have been early sects, never canonized, long lost, who resisted this reset, who kept the old lunar calendar, followed solstice rites, counted weeks by a rhythm that predated Abraham. They didn't call it heresy. They called it memory. And memory, as we've seen, is dangerous. Because when you reset the calendar, you don't just change dates, you change stories. Easter becomes a movable feast, divorced from its Jewish roots. Pentecost is counted forward mechanically, not organically. Christmas, placed neatly at the winter solstice, replaces Saturnalia, Mithras, Sol Invictus. You begin to realize the church didn't just sanctify time, it colonized it. And perhaps the greatest cover-up was not of events, but of rhythm. You close your eyes. Imagine, just for a moment, if sacred time had evolved differently. If Christians still gathered on the 14th of Nisan, under the same moon Jesus did. If the calendar still breathed in lunar pulses, not fixed dates, if liturgy still moved with the sky, what would that faith feel like? Maybe slower, maybe softer, maybe older. But for now, you check your calendar. Easter is coming. Again. And no one remembers why it changed. The moon is full again, but this time it feels heavier, hung like a silver coin in a sky that remembers. You walk cobbled streets in silence, the night air cool and still. There's no festival, no torchlight parade, only an old familiar tension, tucked into the bones of the date itself. It's Friday, the 13th, and something old stirs beneath the surface. You might think of bad luck, black cats, broken mirrors, superstitions tucked into modern calendars like errant thorns. But this fear, this date, it didn't always exist. It began with blood. The year is 1307, the month October, the day Friday the 13th. And the betrayal. Vatican, deep. You've already met the Knights Templar in these dark hallways. The warrior monks who grew too powerful, too wealthy, too independent. The ones who whispered secrets beneath churches, who revered strange relics, who may have found something under Solomon's temple and never quite said what. But on this day, their order collapses. King Philip IV of France, drowning in debt to the Templars, coordinates with Pope Clement V. In a single, ruthless sweep, hundreds of Templars are arrested, tortured, forced to confess to bizarre charges spitting on crosses, idol worship, secret rituals. On that morning, their Grand Master Jacques de Molay is seized, and everything changes. There is no due process, no chance for rebuttal. The Church, supposed guardian of justice, stands silent. Or worse, complicit. Because this purge wasn't about faith, it was about money. The Templars held enormous assets, land, gold, political leverage, and Philip wanted it. Clement, too weak to resist, or perhaps too deeply entangled, granted permission. The charges were absurd, the trials rigged, the confessions extracted by fire and fear, and yet the order was dissolved. You picture it now, the flames licking at the base of the stake. De Molay stands defiant. He calls down judgment upon Pope and King. And in the years that follow, both men die, unnaturally, unexpectedly. The legend is born, but here's where the conspiracy deepens. The records from those trials, detailed, damning, vanished for centuries, until 2001 when the Chinon parchment was discovered in the Vatican's archives, a document signed by Pope Clement himself, absolving the Templars in secret. Let that settle in. The Pope knew. He knew the confessions were false. He knew the charges were political. And still, he let it happen. Why? Because the machinery was already in motion. Because reversing it would have meant undermining papal authority. Because the Church would rather burn the innocent than admit to a mistake that large. So instead, it covered it up. And a date, just another Friday, became a whisper. A curse. You begin to see the outlines of something older, a story not of knights and kings, but of systems that erase truth for convenience. Friday the 13th wasn't unlucky. It was engineered. And the curse, perhaps it wasn't supernatural. Perhaps it was a warning. Here's a fringe detail. Most Missum Templar relics disappeared during the arrests. A fleet of ships docked at La Rochelle. Vanished. Never found. No logs, no wreckage. Some believe the Templars escaped, with gold, with documents, with something else. And if you believe the darker threads, those survivors re-emerged later, hidden in guilds, in lodges, in secret brotherhoods that carried their symbols in silence forward. The skull and crossbones, the Red Cross, the Twin Riders. They never came back openly, but they may have watched as the Church grew heavier with its own myths, watched as Friday the 13th became folklore, watched as history forgot, or thought it did, because what was erased wasn't just the Templars, it was the Vatican's role in their fall. And that's the real cover. Up, you stand now in a dark chapel. The floor beneath you is tiled with symbols, some Christian, some not. A shaft of moonlight strikes the marble at just the right angle, illuminating a date carved faintly into the stone. Octobris MC Sep, the day of betrayal, the night the flame turned inward, and the morning when silence became survival. The superstition, it's just a remnant, but the truth, it still flickers. You're in the candlelit corner of a tiny chapel, bare walls, a single window, and in the center, a painted icon of a man with a dog's head. Yes, a dog's head. This is Saint Christopher, or rather, what's left of him. You've heard the name 1,000 times. The patron saint of travelers. His medallion hangs from rearview mirrors. His image carved into keychains, bracelets, tattoos. He's everywhere, and yet nowhere. Because the Church quietly demoted him, officially. St. Christopher's feast day was removed from the universal calendar in 1969, relegated to local veneration. The reason, doubt over whether he ever existed. And just like that, gone. But who was he? really? And why was he erased? Let's begin with the basics. The legend goes that Christopher was a giant, a Canaanite, in some tellings, who vowed to serve the greatest king on earth. He first pledged loyalty to a human ruler, then to the devil, then finally to Christ, whom he found in a child he carried across a river. The child grew heavier with every step, and when Christopher reached the other side, the child revealed himself. You have carried the weight of the world, a parable, a miracle, a saint. But then come the strange details. In early Eastern icons, Christopher doesn't look like a man. He's drawn with the head of a dog, not symbolically, literally. He's labeled as a cynocephalus, a dog-headed man, a race known in ancient geography, said to live on the edges of the world, fierce, foreign, not quite human. Why would a saint be drawn that way? Some scholars suggest it's a mistranslation, Canaanite confused with canine. Others argue it's symbolic, an image of his beastly nature before conversion. But the consistency of the imagery across multiple regions, Egypt, Greece, Russia, suggests something deeper, and perhaps something older. In fringe traditions, Christopher wasn't just a man who served Christ. He was a creature tamed by the divine, a being from the margins of mythology, brought into the Christian fold. His inclusion signaled something powerful, that even the monstrous could be saved. But the church of the later centuries grew uncomfortable with such fluidity. Saints were supposed to be examples, models, not mysteries, and Christopher's image, towering, wild, otherworldly, didn't fit. So, over time, his story was softened. He lost his canine features. He was humanized, normalized, sanitized, then finally deleted, not condemned. That would be too obvious. Just quietly. Left out, and that's the method of a mature system. Not fire, not denunciation, but omission. It's how you erase someone not just from memory, but from relevance. And yet, the people wouldn't let go. In folk devotion, St. Christopher remained. Travelers clutched his medal. Pilgrims whispered his name. In Mexico, in Greece, in the Philippines, his image remained on walls, in hearts, in fear and faith. Because in a world full of chaos, there's comfort in a protector who knows the wildness of the road, who has been the outsider, who carries the divine even when unworthy. And that's what may have made Christopher so threatening. Not that he wasn't real, but that he wasn't controllable. You reach out now to the old icon, the one with the dog's head, still tucked away in an obscure monastery. His eyes look back at you, not fierce, not savage, just loyal, faithful, forgotten, and you realize St. Christopher may have been a myth, but sometimes myths carry truth. The facts are afraid to tell, and so with him, this journey ends. The 40 greatest cover-ups of ancient history weren't all about scandal, or power, or even deception. Some were quiet, gentle, a trimming of the vine to make the tree grow straight. Others were not. But all shared one thing, a fear of too many versions, a need to shape the story, to keep faith within boundaries, and yet, in the dark, behind the curtain, in forgotten scrolls and sealed archives and strange carvings on cave walls, the other stories remain, waiting, whispering, watching. Now, the lights have dimmed. The secrets, for now, are safely folded back into the dust of time. The archives have locked their doors. The scrolls returned to their clay jars. The voices of the forgotten saints and suspicious monks fading into silence. You're still here, of course, but slower now, a little heavier with thought. History is not a straight road. It twists, doubles back, hides its keys beneath floorboards and inside sacred tombs. You've walked a path tonight paved not in certainty, but in suggestion, in questions no one dared ask out loud, and answers no one ever quite confirmed. And that's where the truth lives, isn't it? Not in doctrine or decree, but in the tension between what might have been and what had to be believed. You've traveled through vanished libraries, heard desert prophets murmur beneath stars, watched saints crumble into metaphor. You've seen how a calendar can be rewritten, how silence can be more powerful than denial, how belief, shaped by vote and vision, becomes law. But tonight, none of that asks anything of you. Not decision, not defense, just stillness. Let the whispering walls go quiet now. Let the flickering candle of conspiracy dim to a warm ember. Let the great myths wrap themselves around you, not to deceive, but to comfort. You don't need all the answers. You just need rest. Close your eyes, breathe deep, and let the shadows of the past carry you gently into sleep.